reason there gasoline or the agricultural spawns. The Vermilion English almost came from, not from Europe, it came out of sort of nowhere. It spawned by itself. It sort of came from after the agriculture established plateau, and how the legal passive aggressive really got in there. These dysfunction hazards, whether dysfunction hazards entities, whether also entities, whether reason there and whether entities, began this sort of America. It could be also with whether combined with the contaminates of many of the leaders, whether prominent individuals, and these are passive aggressively vicious and quite match a lot of the boogeymen, these axemen, etc. And yet could be quite a downplay. We must turn things around, right? Check out how any of my mentions is constantly belittled against. This stuff is going to result in microwave and possibly chemical weapons against a lot. A lot of the apps are not denouncing to the criminals, and this would result in the lots of this simply display the criminals. Rather seems like it's cheering the criminals while it doesn't want to offend us too much. So if they're part of the criminal team, the amount of this weirdness, this healthy, whether being smart, there's sheer amount of these educated freaks which got into the literally stole the position, not due to ransom, and whether also combined with corruption. This heavy corruption doesn't get arrested, the police are doing nothing. This literally is no law state. And definitely probably there's no justice, right? Whether it's a lawless state, and probably even worse because it's not mentioned as a lawless state. Is there such thing as a sort of that lawless state, whether it's in a lawless state, sort of whether they announced a lawless state? That would be still much for lawful. That's right. There's courts. What is all that? Remove all of it. I don't want to. It serves nothing. If you offend some person's ego, shoot them. If you offend some Nazi's ego, there it is. Accountable as replacement of recent mention. There's a lot to condemn. There's corruption throughout places, like the words global terrorism. Right. Lots of the degens spreading to check on the mode, on whether essentially whether very pretty much, or whether very much of, and whether much of, and whether also whether much of, to check on the language instead of on the modus. Why it's using it, that's sort of considered as a lie, right? And whether it's distortion, and whether also manipulation, whether distortion, whether Nazism manipulation reason there, whether also Nazism, whether therefore whether reason there, and whether Nazism distortion, and whether another whether distortion, whether another Nazism, whether Nazi distortion, whether another whether there, whether reason there, whether reason, whether there, whether another, whether before, whether whether another, whether there, whether reason thereof, and whether, and whichever sort of option of the two of the three, whether three of the three, whether each of those, the namely thereof, and whether sort of the namely of it sort of represents a multiple couple of which, and whether the couple of it could be considered, and whether not is a distortion of, and whether also another, and whether the option of, and whether also, and whether as, and distortion of the probable of which, whether probable of also could be considered. Reason there, and whether the phrase, and whether it's probable of, and whether reason there, and whether it's probable considerable, and whether it's probable of, and whether it's considerable of, and whether it's probable of, considerable of, a bit of minor override, whether also whether overrides of. Since and whether countable as sort of that's a distortion, since it comes from the very this right standard is contaminated, and lots of the features of the Nazism, whether lots of the ordinances, lots of it, they're more legitimate than our guys now. They're more legitimate than the cultural pioneers and founders. We should check on in the case of the Gorems also, whether in the case of the Gorems, even whether within whether with bracket mark and whether bracket marks, for whether reason they're just, or whether reason they're found, whether reason they're, and whether bracket marks of, and whether reason they're bracket marks of. Suitable to check whether in those cases of even be to check whether reason there need to check on the hobbies, on the traits, characteristics, and whether reason there on the Gorem hobbies and the Gorem traits, and whether reason there and whether in Gorem and whether reason there and whether Gorham entries. Complete matching, whether more complete, and whether complete, or whether reason there another, whether reason there more complete, whether reason there are lots of contents, and whether reason there considerable amount of materials, and whether mentions are imposed on block, and also there are additional, whether there are other mentions, and whether reason thereof, and whether mine instead, and whether reason there, and whether reason there, and whether reason thereof, and whether mine instead, and whether reason there, and whether reason thereof, and whether mine instead. There are materials imposed on, and whether there are also other materials, whether reason there, whether mine instead of, and whether reason there, mine rather of, and whether reason there, whether, and whether mine rather of. There are other, and whether reason there, and whether there are other materials, or whether reason there, whether reasons, and whether reason there, and whether reasons, and whether first of, and whether reason, and whether reason there, and whether reason there just, and whether reason there. And whether there are materials imposing on, and whether there are materials, and whether reason there, and whether reason thereof, and whether reason there, and whether there are materials on the other mediums of, whether reason there, and whether reason there, and there are materials on the other mediums also. Two of which, whether two of reasons of, and whether reasons thereof, and whether reason thereof. To of reasons thereof, to both whether to, and whether reason there, and whether to probable, and whether reason there, and to both option whether reason there, and also whether reason there, and whether reason there, and whether to probable, and whether reason there, and whether to probable, and whether reason there, and whether reason, and whether reason there, and whether to probable, and whether reason there, and whether to both options, and whether reason there, and whether to both options of. Whether reason there, and whether it's both options to could be of, and whether reason there to both options to suitable of, and whether to probable, and whether to probable to hearing, whether reason there, and whether it's probable to hearing of, and whether to reason there, and whether it's probable of to also to could be of, to probable, and whether reason there to probable of to also to could be of.